and turn the floor over to Robin White. Thank you very much. I'll just remind everyone to keep your cameras off, your microphones off, and we'll save your questions to the end. Thanks, and over to you, Robin.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the introduction. It's my pleasure to be able to leverage our webinar connection here to share some of my thoughts with you guys about sustainability in the dairy industry. So this is a combination of some of the work that our team has explored over the last several years, and then a lot of items that have been done by other teams, looking at trying to pull together some ideas around the strength and opportunities for enhancing the role of dairy production toward contributing to global food security. So in terms of a little bit of a roadmap, I'd like to start out with some discussion around the concepts of food sustainability, move into a snapshot of sustainability as it pertains to the dairy industry, define some of the goals and targets. This is always a moving target. So for how the industry is kind of exploring sustainability objectives at this time, and then to talk about some of the emerging or future perspectives in the environmental impact area that are kind of coming down the pipeline and influencing how we define goals and targets for the industry. So it's really no secret to most folks in animal agriculture that we spend a lot of time talking about sustainable food systems. This past summer, the World Food Summits were going on, and these consolidated a number of working group efforts around some documents, and one of which actually proposed kind of an updated working definition of what a sustainable food system is. And I think it's always useful in these discussions to kind of evaluate what our current definitions are around sustainability of food production. And there's a little bit to be learned by evaluating how those change over time. So the World Food Summit defines sustainable food systems, or a sustainable food system, as one that contributes to food security and nutrition for all in such a way that the economic, social, cultural, and environmental bases to generate food security and nutrition for future generations are safeguarded. So there's a number of important components of this definition, and this is part of why I like it. The first is that we're focusing on food security and nutrition. And again, at this point, we're all fairly well aware of the projected changes in global population towards the years 2050 and 2100, and the uncertainty around those projections of what our global population may look like. What I think is also really interesting is the information around food insecurity. So this chart here let me get a pointer here, the right hand of your screen shows food security as a proportion of the global population published by FAO. And what you may not be aware of is, since we started monitoring food insecurity, at least in this form in 2014, we've actually noted about a 2% increase in the proportion of the population that qualifies as food insecure. A portion of that increase might be due to better record keeping and better understanding of those populations which experience food insecurity. But we also need to try and ask questions about how much things like our growing population and the associated responses to other temporal challenges like climate change are contributing to these early rises in what we see as a change in the food security on the global scale. Now, the other part of this sustainability definition that I like is the traditional adherence to what we used to consider to be kind of three legs of a stool. Now we kind of separate one of those legs out into two separate elements, but focusing on sustainability as the nexus of economic viability, social acceptability, support for cultural norms, and support for environmental impact. It's likely, again, no secret to most folks in agriculture that we have challenges with the variability around food pricing and agricultural input pricing. And we can see things like, again, FAO data on food price inflation and the variability year to year associated with that, as evidence of some of the types of challenges that we need to be exploring when evaluating the economic viability of our food production systems. They need to not only do things like make a profit, but they also need to consider long-term robustness in the face of economic variation. In terms of things like our environmental bases, we can look at information like the explored temperature change between the 1960s and current, which is, again, this is FAO data looking at that fairly linear increase in the temperature change, which we've experienced already, and exploring how we can simultaneously adapt to climate change and attempt to limit the effect of animal agriculture in contributing further to temperature changes in particular. And then when we think about things like the social and cultural bases to support food security, from a social standpoint, we have a number of challenges around consumer perception of animal agriculture products, and we'll touch on that kind of throughout the talk today. But I think it's also important to highlight some of the cultural challenges, notably that this decline in employment in the agricultural populations, which is fairly well documented in developing or developed countries like the US and Canada, is also prevalent worldwide. And as we have fewer and fewer individuals employed in the agricultural industries, we have more challenges associated not only with public perception of those industries or understanding of them, but also around how to maintain kind of that aspect of culture. Now, the last component that I think is really important of this definition is that a sustainable food system needs to focus on safeguarding these bases, economic, social, cultural, environmental, not only for the current population, but really thinking about how our actions today influence our ability to provide food for future generations. And again, we can consider the long-term challenges with projected populations, changes in land use associated with population pressure, economic pressure, and climate change, and things like the expected influence of climate change on global hunger as underpinnings for why this consideration of kind of the long-term impacts of today's decision-making becomes really important. So, this definition is a very nice place to start discussions on sustainability, but it's also really helpful to remember that sustainability is not in any way, shape, or form a new idea. This definition, these elements of it, that it's focusing on economic, social, cultural, environmental bases, that we're considering what we do today and how it impacts populations tomorrow. This is almost the same concepts as was used to define sustainability in the Brundtland Report, which was published back in 1987. And those concepts are also very similar to what was proposed in the Handbook of Forestry in the 1700s, which is the document credited for originally kind of proposing our contemporary definition of sustainability, that you should not be harvesting any more from a forest at any given time than that ecosystem can replenish, considering, again, kind of the long-term implications of today's decisions. So many of these tenets of our definition of sustainability have been around for quite some time, although we do continue to kind of wordsmith and refine exactly what key indicators are included in that definition. So because this concept has been rehashed so many times, I think it's safe to assume that in many ways, the push toward improving sustainability of our food products is probably an objective that's going to be here for quite some time. Now, I would point out that this probably suggests that it hasn't been an objective historically, and that's not what I'm trying to implicate here, merely that this probably has been and will continue to be an important objective of animal agriculture, regardless of whether it's one that we've been kind of documenting and publicizing over the last several years. So when we think about sustainable solutions, there's a number of things that we need to consider, and these are also informed by that definition. And it's useful to kind of reframe the definition in the context of what a sustainable solution might look like, because it helps inform the way that we interpret research. So for example, we know from these different kind of tenets of sustainability, or these bases that we are trying to safeguard, that sustainable solutions need to focus on economic, social, cultural, and environmental objectives. But we also really need to pay attention to the fact that there's kind of a time-sensitive element to this, because we're focusing on changes in our climate and changes in global population. Those driving forces are operating on a time scale that's fairly short. And in many times when we're looking at things like targets and objectives that have been set out to try and, for example, mitigate environmental impact of agriculture, we might be talking on the standpoint of less than a decade, if we're talking about targets for 2030, or in just about 2 and a bit decades, if we're talking about targets for 2050. And so thinking through the time scale on which improvements in these bases of sustainability can be affected is also fairly important when evaluating the sustainable solutions that have been proposed for agricultural systems. So keeping that in mind, I think that it's always useful to try and prioritize the problems that we're facing, to try and identify the current contributors to those problems, and then limit the contributions of those contributors. This is not, a novel frame of logic here, right? It's a simple approach to trying to understand the situation that we're in at present time. So most folks are familiar at this point with the seminal work by Rockstrom and colleagues back in 2009, which explored this concept of a safe operating space for humanity. And they evaluated that safe operating space in terms of a number of different environmental dimensions, and identified that as of that time, we already exceeded a safe operating space in terms of biosphere integrity, in terms of biogeochemical flows, in terms of climate change, and in terms of land system change. And these would be metrics like looking at the emissions of phosphorus and nitrogen from our anthropogenic system, looking at anthropogenic climate change, looking at the rate of species loss in terms of biodiversity, and the rate of land use change. That work has been followed up with a number of different studies, kind of at the global scale, which try to evaluate the next question, right? So we've prioritized some problems through this Rockstrom study, and the follow-up to that has really been trying to identify how specifically different elements of agriculture contribute to those different problems. And so if we focus on some of them here from the Springman work that went into the Eat Lancet report, which you may be familiar with back in 2018. This was some work looking at how different agricultural commodities contribute to environmental impacts, greenhouse gas emissions, cropland use, water use, nitrogen and phosphorus application in the current time, using 2010 as a benchmark, or in a projected agricultural system in 2050, where we assume kind of standard economic drivers have been operating between the contemporary and the future scenario. And what we're seeing is that this is standardized to 100% of the current environmental pressure, and particularly for things like greenhouse gas emissions. Animal agriculture, which is the red portion of this bar, is expected or is currently a major contributor. And based on the expected economic pressures and how animal agriculture may change by 2050, this work would suggest that it would be maybe the largest growing environmental impact concern over the next several decades. Now, When we think about these types of global assessment, it's really important to remember that context, geographical context, matters. So when we're doing things like identifying contributors, what contributions may look like on a global scale can differ from what they look like in individual countries. So this is a comparison of the different sources of greenhouse gas emissions in the US and globally. On a global scale, livestock are nearly 60% of agricultural emissions, though they're just over 40% in the US. And agricultural emissions, if we skip to that bottom line, is about 25% of total emissions on a global scale, but less than 10% of total emissions in the US. And what that means is that when we look at livestock emissions as a percent of total emissions, in the US, our number is quite a bit different than the global average. And so, considering the global context around these types of numbers becomes really important for identifying where we should place emphasis for perhaps adapting an agricultural system toward more sustainable practices. Now, another important consideration is kind of the practicality around how we might adapt agricultural systems and what potential unintended consequences there may be. So some work that Mary Beth Hall and I did back in 2017 explored within the US context what might happen if we took a fairly pragmatic interpretation of some of these global studies and eliminated animal agriculture from our US agricultural system and explored what could be expected to happen in terms of food supplies and in terms of greenhouse gas emissions reductions. So eliminating animals from the US agricultural system could reduce emissions by 28%, but that doesn't equate to the 50% of emissions that are currently associated with animals, or at least in this study, what we had kind of benchmarked as attributable to animal agriculture. Now, this reduction, this kind of smaller reduction than anticipated, occurred regardless of whether we were accounting for some offsetting balances, like things like trying to combust or remove inedible byproducts that were previously consumed by ruminant animals to synthesize fertilizer that previously came from animal manures. Those two bars reflect this very small gray portion down at the bottom of this without animals scenario. The biggest difference between these two scenarios is the attribution of grains and legume products in particular toward the production of animal feed versus repurposing those products for human food consumption. So regardless of the current contributions of animals, we identified that there's a fairly limited reduction in agricultural greenhouse gas emissions associated with this pretty dramatic change in our agricultural system. And although, a 28% reduction is fairly substantial and could go quite a ways toward meeting things like, international obligations toward perhaps the Paris Agreement, there are some unintended consequences that we need to consider when we think about the practicality of this type of scenario. So if we look at the food production coming from a system without animals versus the system with animals, we did produce more food in the system without animals compared with our current agricultural system. But because our current agricultural system is about 44% by weight animal products, when we eliminate that portion of the pie chart, the proportion of products available for human consumption looks a lot different than it does right now. And a portion of that is because we assumed that we would keep land use within the US fairly constant. Now it's possible that we could repurpose portions of land that's currently used for the production of corn and soy, but there's a lot of economic pressures which contribute to land use, as are social and cultural pressures. And accounting for those in this type of study would induce more variability than we were ready to swallow. So although this is just a snapshot of what it might look like if we kind of went down this path, it helps reveal some of the important roles of animal agriculture presently. Now, perhaps the most important part of that is if we look at the profile of nutrients consumable from these systems, eliminating animal agriculture reduced the domestic availability of calcium, vitamin A, vitamin D, riboflavin, B12, DHA, EPA, arachidonic acid, and alpha-linolenic acid. So although we had more of most nutrients, there were also reduced supplies of many nutrients. And what we see is those nutrients also tended to be ones that were already in fairly low supply relative to the US population. So in addition to considering things like global scale, we also need to think about the time scale over which we're trying to affect change, or the time scale over which we're evaluating the impacts of current agricultural systems. So for example, this is a FAO publication which looks at land use consideration. They identified 26% of land globally was used for grazing and suggested that each year 13 billion hectares of forest are lost due to land conversion for agricultural uses. Now, this is interesting because if you then look at the same source, FAO, within a slightly different time frame, so this publication looked at 1997 to 2012. If we look from 2005 to 2018, in terms of the area in different land uses, we do see that there's a reduction in tree covered areas, though the change in hectares per year is on a substantially different scale than suggested by the previous document. But we also have a reduction in the grassland area. So although, we kind of suggest here that there's increase in the development of pastures, perhaps that's not well supported when we look at a different time scale for that data. Either way, when we look at this context of trying to prioritize some of the problems that we're facing, identifying current contributors and limiting the contributions of those contributors, there is a fair amount of data suggesting that animal agriculture is a major contributor, both at a national and an international level. And we can spend a fair amount of time kind of debating the exact contributions of animal agricultural systems, or we can kind of adopt the mentality that sustainable solutions are our responsibility as an industry and our opportunity. And so, in terms of kind of the food sustainability picture right now, this is a complex and kind of multifaceted concept. And in a lot of ways, sustainability is a moving target. And I mean that in as much as the exact definition and relative importance of those components of the definition, and in terms of identifying the different contributions of our various industries and how they work into the picture of sustainable agriculture or sustainable human societies. Either way, it's a pragmatic approach for our industries to begin working toward sustainable production, simply because all of the data suggests that these are going to be important practices over the next several decades, regardless of current contributions. So if we look at kind of a snapshot of sustainability, I think it's really nice to look at some time series data and reflect on whether impacts are getting worse over time. So this is a graph showing our population data here on the top, and then things like our plant and animal sourced food products, right? And then various environmental impacts, things like the agricultural greenhouse gas emissions, water extraction, nitrogen and phosphorus utilization for those systems. And regardless of which line we're looking at on this plot, there's kind of an upward trend to each one. But consider that all of these trends are also in the context of our growing population. So we have this confounding effect of time and population size. And if we look at things standardized to population, we're increasing production of plant products per person. We have marginal increases in the production of animal products per person. We have reductions in crop and grassland area used for food production on a per person basis, reductions in agricultural greenhouse gas emissions per person, and reductions in agricultural water use per person. So, although we continue to talk about sustainable solutions as an important objective, I do think it's useful to note that a lot of what we've been doing over the last several decades in agriculture has contributed at least to more efficient strategies to feed people, at least on a per person basis. So when evaluating kind of our current considerations in the dairy industry, I think it's useful to take this same lens and kind of look at some historical trends to talk about the current contributions of dairy products to our food production system, and then to look at the same kind of theoretical omission scenario, where if we were to remove animals from the system, what that might look like. Many of you are probably familiar with the work from Jude Capper, originally looking at 1944 to 2007, and then a follow-up from 2007 to 2017, which highlights the fact that there's tremendous historical improvements in the sustainability metrics of the dairy industry. We've been improving efficiency of these production systems, and in many ways, that's contributed to more economically viable farming systems. I would highlight, though, in terms of the true kind of breadth of sustainability, we do have a little bit of work left to do on understanding how social acceptability has changed historically and how we might influence it in the future. If we look at some work that was done by a PhD student of mine, went out in JDS a couple years ago, looking at the current contributions of nutrients supplied by dairy cattle in the US. This is the percent of total human edible nutrients supplied by dairy, so percent of those coming from our agricultural system. And you'll note that for things like calcium, vitamin D, and B12, more than half of our domestic supplies in the US of these nutrients are coming from the dairy industry. For many of our things like our different amino acids, it's close to a quarter of our domestic supplies of those nutrients are coming from dairy products, which is a pretty substantial contribution from a single industry. If we explore, which we did in this paper, the theoretical omission of dairy cattle from the food production system, we were a little bit more comprehensive in this study than we were in the 2017 paper in terms of evaluating how our assumptions around land use change might differ when we no longer have to feed dairy cattle. So we have a number of these land use assumption scenarios. And the major takeaways from this is if we compare carbon footprints from the current production system, if we just retire cattle, so these animals are retired out to pasture, they're kind of maintained in their current populations. We don't have to do any kind of mass harvest to reduce them down to a appropriate carrying capacity for the land. There's actually no environmental benefit associated with that type of scenario. And the reason why we included this kind of silly scenario of retiring cows was that if you ask the average American what would happen if we stopped consuming dairy products, they don't equate that to mass harvest of our dairy animals and elimination of those animals from the biosphere. They equate that to kind of retiring those animals out onto nice pastures and where they can live out a happy life. So they would effectively become feral cows. The only way that we achieve environmental impact reduction associated with removing dairy would be to either depopulate those animals, where we do go through kind of a mass harvest event, in which case we have a fairly nominal reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, or if we retire those animals to feral herds and depopulate them to a point that they're at an appropriate carrying capacity for the available land resources, we could also achieve a nominal environmental impact improvement. However, the challenges associated with maintaining a feral population of grazing ungulates, I think, are well represented by kind of our urban infiltration of things like deer in many portions of the US, and the existing challenges in the Western US associated with feral horse populations. So there's probably a number of social and economic considerations that would need to go into exploring exactly what that type of scenario would look like. On top of it all, if we were to explore these different scenarios, in almost every case, we would experience a pretty marked reduction in the availability of some of these important nutrients. So our various amino acids and some important vitamins and minerals for which dairy is an important supply. So, in terms of summary there, eliminating dairy cattle from our population, regardless of kind of how we go about that, may require a little bit more consideration, because although there's occasionally a nominal environmental impact improvement associated with removal, there are, again, nutritional consequences to be considered when achieving that environmental impact reduction. So a snapshot of sustainability in our industry today, if we look at historical improvements, our current contributions, or this kind of scenario where we might be eliminating animals, based on most of those assessments, dairy sustainability metrics are fairly promising. The dairy industry has a fairly favorable environmental impact, which has been decreasing over time. It provides important contributions in terms of nutrient supplies to our food production system. And we don't see a kind of win-win scenario associated with eliminating or reducing the populations of dairy animals when going through these kind of counterfactual evaluations. So we can transition now, I think, and talk a little bit about some of the goals and targets that the industry is moving toward in terms of trying to continue to enhance sustainability, embracing the idea that we kind of can do our part. And this is a fun kind of update to this work, because in many ways, the goals are already set. We have announced, at least in the US, work toward a net zero initiative, which focuses on these 2050 environmental stewardship goals to achieve greenhouse gas neutrality, optimize water use, and improve water quality. So this is nice that the dairy industry has made this effort. And I want to highlight the fact that it's really important that the industry has moved toward this as an industry-wide goal, rather than allowing kind of niche marketing to develop around sustainable or environmentally friendly products. So I'll go through this a little bit quickly, but this is some work that we did back in 2014, looking at the willingness to pay, consumers' willingness to pay for different attributes of meat. And although we're looking at meat, many of the overall conclusions probably translate across these kind of food labels, which focus on attributes like high quality, local, environmental, or combinations of those types of attributes. What we see for environmental labeling is that when environmental labeling is employed by itself, there's a very, very minimal willingness to pay by consumers to support that type of product. When it is coupled with local attributes, there's a much greater willingness to pay. And so this is the idea that you're internalizing the externality. People are much more willing to support water quality for the stream in their backyard than they are to support a nebulous kind of effort to improve US or national water quality. The other part of this is to highlight the fact that there is pretty tremendous variability around what consumers will pay for these types of products. Now, what this means is that if we explore that out on an industry-wide basis, this fairly nominal willingness to pay for environmental impact and the variability around that, we can see the proportion of consumers that might be willing to purchase a product is going to change as that willingness to pay increases. But so too might be the environmental impact reduction we could achieve with that investment, if you will, that willingness to pay. And effectively what this highlights is the fact that we get a much greater reduction in the environmental impact on an industry basis from having a smaller cost increase than we would by pushing something out to a fairly substantial cost increase, which might be reflective of a niche product. So the idea is that in order to actually achieve a notable improvement in environmental impacts, we really need the majority of producers within an industry buying in. It can't be a small proportion of the industry to really realize any effect there. So our global effort as an industry needs to be considering how we're going to continue these types of trends across the industry as a whole. And so that's going to be largely, let me just ignore this phone call, sorry about that. It's going to be largely driven by continuing to work toward improved productivity. So this is an example of what it might look like scaling out to 2050 if we continue kind of a linear projection in terms of milk production, pounds per cow, or if we look at perhaps a more exponential projection of what we could achieve. And likely we may be able to get somewhere between those two lines. Now, although these trends are really important, we also need to consider the distribution around those trends. So if we look at kind of a strange metric, this is the aggregate protein produced from ruminant animals per animal on an international basis from 1960 out to 2020. The best producers and the average are increasing fairly substantially, but those that are struggling are continuing to struggle. So we got to think through not just averages and those examples of really good production, but also what the tails of the distribution look like. Another important consideration is that we need to focus on more than just footprints. It's very easy to focus exclusively on footprints, but we also need to focus on the absolute impacts of the industry. And if we look at some strategies to address environmental footprints and absolute impacts, it becomes more important or more apparent why these are complementary objectives, right? So if we focus on 4 ways to reduce environmental impact or environmental footprints, we can do this by producing more product, typically in less time, using fewer animals or reduced inputs. We can also just do this by using all of the same inputs and producing more product. But the challenge there is that we're unlikely to reduce absolute impacts in that way. And if we look at the goals and targets that have been defined by the industry, we need to be working toward greenhouse gas neutrality, which may require things like focusing on reducing our animal populations, producing product faster or with fewer delays within the systems, direct mitigation of environmental impacts, and reducing the inputs used within those systems. So there's some additional caveats or approaches which may be required to reduce absolute impacts, which might not always be revealed when we look on a footprint basis. So in terms of defining goals and targets, I think we have great industry messaging there. Much of the science is in place to be able to continue the historical trends that we have been able to capitalize on. We do still need some work exploring some social and economic dimensions. And as an industry, we do need to be thinking about these differences between targeting footprints and targeting absolute impacts. Right, so in terms of some future perspectives, definitely carbon emissions are a major topic, both on a national and an international scale. And although this is the case, it's useful to remember that when we're focusing on productivity improvement, carbon, water use, and land use tend to be complementary objectives. So this is a 2016 paper where we looked at the potential change in environmental impacts, land use, water use, and greenhouse gas emissions in a system with current average feed efficiency, or in a system with a 15% improvement in feed efficiency, and what type of environmental impact reduction we could get with cost investments or increases between 1 and 20% over a baseline. And what we see is that in many cases, we can simultaneously address all three of these environmental impacts without really compromising another impact. So focusing on those strategies which help us concurrently improve land use, water use, and greenhouse gas emissions, I think is an important objective, regardless of the fact that much of the industry focuses exclusively on greenhouse gases. I also want to highlight the fact that wording really does matter. So even if you look at the media releases around this net zero initiative, there's disagreement both within the scientific community and in terms of the language about what exactly we're proposing here. Are we moving toward net zero carbon emissions? Are we moving toward greenhouse gas neutrality? Are we moving toward warming neutrality? And so I think the industry is actively working to sort that out, and I think in many ways kind of is getting that well in hand. But it does point out that in terms of the emerging or recirculating challenges around greenhouse gas emissions, we do need to be paying attention to things like how methane is treated versus other greenhouse gases. And then we'll talk about some of the other challenges of things like offsets in a little bit. So specifically, warming neutral versus carbon neutral are really two very different things. And this leverages some work by Kane and colleagues from 2019, where they highlighted the fact that because methane is a short-lived pollutant, its contributions to warming don't necessarily map the same way that CO2 contributions do. In scenarios where we have rising emissions, CO2 contributions to warming increase at an increasing rate over time. In a scenario where we have constant emissions, CO2 contributions increase warming linearly over time, though methane emissions, if there is no new methane, there is no new warming. Similarly, if we have falling emissions over time, CO2 doesn't reach steady state until emissions are zero, versus methane, where as soon as we start to reduce methane, we're actually decreasing the warming burden. And once we reach zero emissions, our warming associated with that would be zero. So this type of difference in the way that we're accounting the warming impact from different greenhouse gas emissions is an important consideration in the future. And if we look, for example, at a projection from the Australian sheep meat industry using these radiative forcing based carbon footprinting approaches, we can see that over time, this projection would actually look at a decrease in emissions, largely driven by decreasing historical methane. Right. So this highlights the fact that this accounting for the short-lived nature of methane as a greenhouse gas could be a really promising way to move toward warming neutrality. But if we're truly working on something like eliminating or reaching carbon neutrality, that may be a much more challenging task to work toward. If we look at some historical data on ruminant methane and greenhouse gas emissions from the US, we can see between 1960 and 1980, there was a pretty marked reduction in methane emissions from our industry, which is largely driven by depopulating. I think the question will be, how can we focus on methane in the future to achieve that same type of reduction so that we can really be contributing to moving toward this concept of warming neutral? And there's already been a tremendous amount of work enacted toward that. Things like large scale adoption of lagoons, and exploration of things like feed additives and breeding strategies to reduce methane emissions. So continuing that work and appropriately benchmarking our changes over time, I think, is going to be an important part of the sustainability story for our industry. And then just because I get asked about it all the time, I wanted to throw in this concept of how we handle offsets as an industry. With some of the legislation that went through last year in the US, there's now a lot of interest in selling carbon credits out of agricultural systems. And if we look at the scientific literature evaluating the efficacy of carbon offsets as an approach, particularly for large corporations who are interested in purchasing these offsets as they try to work toward their own sustainability objectives, there's a lot of challenges with these as they currently exist. They tend to not be compatible with a life cycle assessment approach. They don't include all life cycle phases in how those offsets are calculated. And in many times, they're not accounting for collateral negative environmental or social impacts associated with different practices. So at least for the time being, I think that we also should be a little bit leery of getting too far down the road of relying on things like carbon offsets to help work toward this goal of carbon neutrality or warming neutrality. But over time, as we get better agreement on what exactly these are, some of those issues may help resolve. So in terms of, some future perspectives, I think as an industry, we need to be keeping an eye on how to handle some of these emerging, I would call them methodological challenges, and things like methane quantification, carbon credits, and other similar kind of questions. I think I'm a little bit over my 40-minute time. Sorry, Stephen, that's how I roll. But I'm happy to take some questions or have some discussion if folks are interested at this point.
Thanks, Robin. That was awesome. No worries for time. We're all good. So first of all, thank you very much. Genuinely, I mean, plan A would have been to have you here in person, but you finish your semester and that was a sweeping tour de force of a whole lot of data, yours and other people's, and really appreciate that. So we're not an overly huge group here. So if you want to just use your little reactions button and put your hand up and actually speak, that's great. But otherwise, you can use the chat if you prefer that. And actually, I see your first question there already. So I'll paraphrase. So thinking from the producer's side, in terms of pressures or benefits, I think I'm paraphrasing that as incentives. What's being used in the US dairy industry or in terms of making moves towards environmental sustainability?
Yeah, so I think the root of that question is how do we incentivize adoption of environmentally associated production practices? Some of the time, those production practices improve productivity. So it becomes logical to adopt them because they contribute to profitability. I think in many cases, we're kind of at a nexus where we're no longer able to rely on those strategies so much, given the time scale over which we need to make improvements. And we're starting to need to transition more to things like direct mitigation and exploring how we can incentivize those types of practices. So in some programs, like the program in California in particular, they've really done that through partnerships around this concept of offsetting or contributing to the upfront cost of those types of practices. In Virginia, we, like our Department of Conservation and Recreation, it's our environmental department, they're exploring the same thing. How can they start to really use a cost sharing approach to try and facilitate adoption of these types of practices? And usually the economic kind of model there is that there's upfront cost sharing, there's opportunity for differentiating product or revenue in the long run, and there's a pay per environmental impact reduction which may go on for a period of like 2 to 5 years. So, or at least that's kind of our model. I don't know the California one in that degree of detail, but in many cases, at least right now in the US, a lot of that is coming from governmental programs. There's also a lot of private industry interest in sorting out how to monetize environmental impact reductions through things like these offset markets. And that's part of why I think I, over time, have put that portion into this talk, because it's almost always a question that comes up. And I think that there's potentially opportunity there in the long run, but at least from my standpoint, I'd be fairly leery of that in the short term, because it may be that you end up banking on income, which is not going to be a long-term viable source. Beyond that, I think it's the standard challenge that we have in agricultural extension, is that same question everyone asks, right? How do you facilitate helping someone adopt a practice? And there's a lot of social and cultural pressures there that go beyond what can be explained by economics.
Yeah, in case the four-legged, four-stomached animal wasn't complex enough, the two-legged animal is way more complex.
Isn't that true?
Yep, thanks for that. I don't know, you can punt this one into the weeds if you want, but what's with Bivair, just recently approved or coming to the US, and it's not officially sort of launched here in Canada yet, but surely coming. So that the 3-NOP rumen fermentation modifier to reduce methane, or the seaweed-based, what is it, asparagosis, I think it is. Just big picture, I'm not looking for an instant lit review here, but big picture, do you think those things are a big deal, a little deal, somewhere in the middle? In terms of actually moving the needle in the US or Canada, in terms of, well, whichever footprint or output you want to use, whether it's just methane per liter of milk or actual total tons coming out of the system.
Yeah, it's a little tricky to know, just because it's not always super clear from preliminary meta-analyses of those types of studies that have been done focusing on those specific products. At least based on most of the ones that I've seen, it seems like there's a pretty interesting reduction in emissions. It seems like it's fairly sustained, though I have less confidence about that. But either way, those are the two kind of must-haves, at least for me, for some sort of feed additive that's going to be the magic dust. I say that facetiously, but I think that that's what a lot of people are expecting out of a feed additive, right? You're going to put it on and it's going to do exactly what you need it to. And I think anyone that's done a nutrition study knows that rarely is the world quite that simple. But I think for the most part, those data are fairly promising in those two aspects, the degree of reduction and the length of sustained reduction. That being said, at least the way our system metrics break down in the US, a much larger portion of methane is coming from either supporting populations in the dairy industry, which perhaps we could treat with these same products, but is actually coming from supporting populations in our other ruminant industries, the beef industry in particular. And so from that standpoint, there's some other practices and things like, industry cooperation and consolidation, which would probably have on an industry scale a much bigger impact than any individual feed additive. But a lot of these things are complementary tools. So, if we find a way to make them economically viable, I think that that's really exciting. Hopefully they have the types of reductions that we've seen in research settings, which is always another question, how translatable some of these things are to production settings. But I don't think that in themselves, they're going to be the only solution we need to be able to address methane. I think things like working toward more integrated beef dairy systems is going to be a big portion of that. and finding strategies to reduce the economic burden of our beef cow herds in particular has to be part of it.
Yep. Oh, cool. Thank you. I'll throw out last call for any final questions or comments as we come towards the end of our time here. And just mention that, yeah, somewhat like the US dairy industry, the officialdom of the collective Canadian dairy industry also announced a net zero, the details are a little fuzzy, but net zero target for 2050 for a national industry. And I think, like you said earlier, I think trying to make sure that, they were sort of onside politically, but also getting out in front of niche or, processor specific things, I would speculate, but then also pretty short on details for the moment as to how that's going to look or who's going to measure it or in what ways and so on and so forth. Lucas, I see your hand is up. I'll give the last question to you. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Dr. Wright, for the presentation. It was great. I think a new perspective for everything related to feed efficiency and to greenhouse gases emissions there. I think it's because of time. You were running out of time, and I was actually waiting for the conversation to shift towards that, and that would be how to actually, or like, where do you think? I think it's a hard question, but where do you think the solution for sustainability would be in, or if we would have a chance of finding something more concrete and something more, more concrete, where it would be? Would it be on nutrition? Would it be on the genetics of the animals? I know, as Dr. LeBlanc here said, the complexity of a 4-stomach animal is like huge already. So I don't know how do you see that if we can actually go only for nutrition, and what's the impact of aiming specifically at nutrition, or if genetics, even though it's not the cow itself, genetics that is responsible for that, for the greenhouse emissions, for example. But where do you think it would be more, I don't know, maybe easier to find something there?
Yeah, so it's funny that you bring that up, because I, in many ways, have weeded that discussion out of my presentations over time, because I don't believe that there's a one-size-fits-all solution to sustainability. And a lot of the ways that we evaluate these kind of simulated farms and how comparisons among perhaps genetic selection, nutrition, reproduction management, health management, how they contribute to carbon footprints are so specific to the starting conditions of that farm that they end up less, useful or applicable given the diversity of starting conditions available within the industry. So that's just a nebulous way of saying these really have to be individually farm driven. Some farms are doing a phenomenal job at nutrition, and perhaps their area of emphasis should be somewhere else. Other farms, perhaps it could focus on nutrition because that's an area where they have struggled historically. So in general, that's why I kind of focus on this 4 ways paradigm, like the different strategies, the different production level targets that we need to be working toward to simultaneously reduce the footprint of environmental impacts off of our operation, but also the absolute impact coming from that operation. And in the assessments that we do have, as a nutritionist, it's quite depressing. Nutrition does not matter so much, or it's less impactful than doing something like long-term intensive genetic selection toward enhanced productivity. And doing things like adopting better reproductive management practices so that we're reducing the amount of time we have, I call them maintenance animals, but non-productive animals within our herds. But again, all of those things are ways in which an individual operation may work toward increasing the total amount of product, reducing the number of animals needed to produce that product, reducing the amount of time needed to produce that product, right? And reducing the inputs required for that product. Direct mitigation, as we kind of talked about with the 3-NLP and the seaweed products, is an area that I do think we probably need a little bit more attention in the long term. But that raises the additional complication, which is the social and the environmental component of sustainability. So part of the reason why these things have to be farm specific is the economics. But as a bigger industry, I guess I'd also put in the plug that we need to sort out some of our messaging around consumer education around production systems, because technology use in particular, whether that's health technology, reproductive technology, genetic selection, feeding technologies, historically have not been well understood by consumers. And if we continue to lose freedom of operation around those types of production practices, we could expect the hill is going to get a lot steeper to climb. So that's kind of a way to not answer your question. But truthfully, I do think that this is like a really important role for the future of extension like industries, or perhaps even veterinary consulting, right? Those individuals that are on the farm providing decision support, incorporation of sustainability decision support, I think is probably what the future looks like, if I have anything to say about it, right?
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucas. Thanks, Robin, very much. With that, I think I'll wrap things up. Thank everybody for attending today. And one more time, really heartfelt thanks, Robin. Just a wealth of information, lots of perspective, and really nicely presented. That's some good food for thought, and helps arm people with some data and some perspective. So thank you again for that. Much
Excellent.
appreciated.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Take care, everybody. Enjoy your day.